My son locked me in a freezer for hours, but I decided his fate. They often look at an old woman and assume she has nothing left to say worth hearing. The lines on her face, the tremor in her hands, the slow shuffle of her steps, people mistake these as signs that the story is over. But they are wrong. The wrinkles are chapters, the tremors are echoes of storms survived, and the shuffle is the rhythm of persistence. My story did not end with age. In fact, it nearly ended in the coldest, cruelest way possible. Inside a walk-in freezer, betrayed by the very boy I once cradled against my chest. That night still presses on my memory like frostbite that never thaws. It wasn't the sound of a gunshot, nor the screech of brakes, nor even the sudden silence after a loved one's last breath. No, the sound that defined my life was the heavy metallic thud of an industrial freezer door closing behind me. A sound so ordinary, yet it carried the weight of finality. It was the sound of trust snapping in two. I remember his face, my son. The child whose hands I once guided to hold a spoon, whose fevered forehead I soothed through long nights, whose shoes I tied when his laces tangled. That same son stood before me with eyes that had grown colder than the ice surrounding me. He did not see his mother, he saw an obstacle. There, in that icy chamber. With the fluorescent light flickering above and the chill rushing into my bones, I learned the hardest truth. Betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from the very blood you nurtured, the one you would have died for without hesitation. At first I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps the heavy door had closed by accident. I pounded on it with my fists, called out, begged for someone to hear. My voice, strong for decades, cracked into the cold air like brittle glass. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, and the truth settled in. He had left me there deliberately. For 7 endless hours I lived in a coffin of steel and frost. I wore only a thin blouse, as if life itself wanted to mock my vulnerability. The cold was not just a physical enemy, it was a voice whispering, give up, let go, close your eyes. And I nearly did. I nearly surrendered to the darkness. Letting the faces of my husband and parents long gone beckon me toward rest. But something unexpected rose within me. Rage. Not a wild, reckless rage, but a focused, burning fury that pierced through the numbness. That anger reminded me that my story was not his to end. My life, my years of work, my memories, my legacy, they were mine, and I would not allow his greed to write my final chapter. I struck the steel door until my knuckles bled. I stomped my feet to keep the blood moving. I recited multiplication tables, sang old hymns, whispered recipes from memory, anything to keep my mind alert, to hold back the frozen fog that crept across my thoughts. At times I hallucinated, seeing my husband standing in the corner with his gentle smile, or my children as toddlers running through aisles of canned goods. Were they memories or visions from a dying brain? I do not know, but each vision reminded me of what I still had to protect. My son thought the freezer would silence me. Instead, it gave me a new voice. A voice sharpened by betrayal, fueled by defiance. When at last the door opened, not by his hand, but by a cleaning woman whose intuition told her something was wrong, I collapsed into light and air that felt warmer than any summer sun. They told me later my body temperature had fallen to 82 degrees. Doctors call it a miracle I survived. I do not call it that, I call it stubbornness. I have always been stubborn, and that night my stubbornness was the only furnace strong enough to fight the ice. Yet survival brought no peace. When I awoke in the hospital bed and saw his face again, feigning shock and concern, I knew the battle had just begun. To everyone else he was the devoted son by his mother's side. But to me he was the man who had already tried to erase me from this world. I lay still, listening, pretending to be weak, pretending to be confused. And in those moments of performance I made my vow I would not confront him yet. I would not scream, not accuse, not crumble. Instead, I would outlast him, outthink him, outfight him. If the freezer could not finish me, neither would he. To those of you listening now, perhaps with gray in your hair and memories stacked high like old photographs, know this: the greatest dangers in life are not always the obvious ones. Sometimes they wear familiar faces. Sometimes they call you mom. And when they turn, the wound is not a cut across the flesh, it is a shattering of the soul. But I am still here. And I will tell my story. Because when betrayal locks you in the cold, you can choose to freeze or you can choose to burn brighter than ever before. When people speak of betrayal, they often imagine it erupting suddenly, like a thunderclap on a clear afternoon. But in truth, betrayal begins quietly in moments so small they almost seem harmless. Looking back, I realized the seeds were planted early. Seeds of ambition, greed, and pride. Seeds I, a hopeful mother, mistook for promise. I remember my son, let's call him David here, when he was just a boy of 10. Bright-eyed, curious, eager to be involved in everything I did. He'd sit on the floor behind the counter of our modest grocery store, shuffling through coins, learning how to count change. Customers would smile and say, "That boy is sharp, he'll make something of himself." And oh, how my chest swelled with pride. I told myself he would be a leader, someone who could carry our family forward when my husband and I grew too old to bear the load. But small signs began to flicker, signs I dismissed. Blinded by love. There was the time he traded his collection of baseball cards to a neighborhood boy for triple their value. The poor child walked away with empty pockets and a grin, unaware of how badly he had been cheated. When I confronted David and told him he should return part of the money, he gave me that charming, mischievous smile and said, "But Mom, he agreed to the price. A deal's a deal." At the time I chuckled. Sharp business sense, I thought. My husband, Mark, teased that our boy might grow up to run Wall Street one day. What I didn't see or refused to see was the glint of something darker in that little victory. Not just ambition, but disregard. A lack of concern for fairness, for compassion. It's often in the smallest victories that a person's character reveals itself. As the years passed, David's cleverness only grew. By high school, he was tutoring classmates for a fee, carefully negotiating rates depending on the subject and difficulty. Some families admired his initiative. Others whispered that he was taking advantage of kids who simply wanted help. Again, I brushed it off. "He's preparing for the real world," I said. "He'll never be taken advantage of." I mistook shrewdness for strength, manipulation for maturity. He worked alongside us in the store after classes, learning the rhythms of business before he could even drive. He'd balance ledgers, analyze receipts, and point out where we could cut costs. By the time he left for college to study finance and business management, I believed wholeheartedly that he would one day take our humble store and transform it into something extraordinary. And he did, just not in the way I ever imagined. David was brilliant in the classroom. Professors sang his praises, classmates admired his leadership. He returned home for the summers with new ideas, modernized systems, talk of expansion, whispers of scaling beyond our little town. My husband and I were proud, perhaps too proud. We trusted his insight more than we should have, not realizing how ambition can harden into hunger when unchecked. Our store grew into a small chain. One location became 2, then 5. We were no longer just grocers, we were business owners of a name people knew. Customers came to us not only for bread and milk, but for familiarity, for the sense of family we fostered in every aisle. Yet behind that warmth, behind the family photos taped to the office wall, a subtle shadow was forming in my eldest son. I remember a particular evening when I overheard him talking with a friend in the back office. His voice carried an edge I had never heard before. "My parents built this, sure," he said, "but they'll never understand what it could become. They think too small. When they're out of the way, I'll show everyone what real leadership looks like." Those words cut me, though he didn't know I was listening. At first, I convinced myself it was just the arrogance of youth, the kind of boastful talk 20-somethings used to impress their friends, but part of me shivered at the certainty in his tone. I told myself all mothers doubt their children at times. I told myself that his sharpness was simply confidence, his pride just youthful fire. And perhaps in those years it was. But as we all learned sooner or later, pride has a way of growing like ivy, winding itself around the heart until it chokes out empathy. My younger children never had that same hunger. They worked in the store when needed, but they valued family dinners, Sunday picnics, and laughter over ledgers. David lived and breathed numbers. Money became his language, profit became his compass, and we, foolish in our love, applauded every step. It is easy to see now that ambition, left unchecked by values, becomes greed, and greed, fed too often, becomes something monstrous. For those of you listening who are older, who carry the weight of decades in your bones, perhaps you understand the blindness of love. You see your child's flaws, but your heart explains them away. You tell yourself they'll grow out of it, that time will soften their edges. You want to believe so badly that you turn warnings into compliments. That was me. Every red flag I transformed into a medal. Every troubling word I twisted into promise. I see it now, painfully clear. But then I was simply a mother, desperate to believe her son was good. And so the seeds were watered. Seeds of pride, ambition, manipulation. They grew quietly, winding their roots deep into the soil of our family's trust. And though I didn't realize it at the time, I was watching the slow bloom of betrayal. One day when the door of that freezer slammed shut, I would remember those moments. The baseball cards, the boastful words, the deals too good to be fair. They weren't isolated events, they were warnings. Signs of a fire that would one day consume everything we had built. But back then, blinded by pride and hope, I only saw light. and light, when too bright, can blind you to the shadows creeping in at the edges. The story of our family's rise was not glamorous. It wasn't some overnight miracle or a lucky lottery ticket. It was sweat, sacrifice, and countless small choices stacked one on top of another, like bricks forming a wall. From the outside, people saw a business grow, but for us it was a life built hour by hour, dawn to dusk. Our first store was little more than a corner shop, a narrow space with wooden shelves that sagged under the weight of canned beans and flour sacks. The paint peeled from the walls, and in summer the air grew so hot that milk spoiled too quickly. But it was ours. My husband Mark and I poured every ounce of energy into that little shop. He lifted crates, haggled with suppliers, and fixed broken equipment. I stood at the register, learned the faces and stories of every customer, and kept track of each cent that passed through the till. People in town often joked that I could hear a single coin hit the counter from the back room and tell them if it was a dime or a nickel. And maybe they weren't wrong. Numbers were second nature to me, not because I had studied finance, but because survival demanded it. When you don't have much, you learn to watch every penny as though it's a heartbeat. David grew up in that store. While other children played stickball or rode bikes until supper, he trailed behind us down the aisles. He counted stock, memorized prices, and mimicked the way his father bargained. He learned fast. By 12, he could run the register almost as quickly as I could. Customers marveled at his sharpness, and we beamed. To us, it felt like destiny. Our boy would take the torch and carry it further than we ever dreamed. Years went by. The little store turned into a modest neighborhood market. Then one spring, after 15 years of scrimping and saving, we opened our second location across town. I still remember the ribbon cutting. We couldn't afford a brass band or balloons, just a pair of scissors borrowed from the school principal and a crowd of neighbors cheering us on. That day, standing beside Mark and our 3 children, I felt richer than any millionaire. Expansion was never easy. Every new store meant long nights, longer debts, and prayers whispered into the silence that we wouldn't lose everything. Mark and I rarely took vacations. Vacations were for people who had the luxury of stopping. For us, the dream of building something lasting carried us through exhaustion. David, our eldest, seemed to thrive on it. He was in college by then, but he'd come home on weekends and holidays, notebook in hand, scribbling new strategies he learned from professors. Inventory systems, he said once, tapping the page as though he were presenting to a boardroom, are the future. Computers will cut errors in half. We can't run this like a mom-and-pop shop forever. Mark chuckled and shook his head. Computers for tomatoes and bread. But I, perhaps foolishly, sided with David. His conviction was contagious. We borrowed again, bought new systems, and before long our records ran smoother than ever. It felt like a small miracle, though in truth it was simply progress. By the time we opened our 5th store, people in town spoke of us not just as shopkeepers, but as entrepreneurs. Local papers ran articles about the family success story. They praised our grit, our hard work, and of course, the sharp young son who was leading us into the modern age. David's name appeared more often than ours, and I let it. After all, isn't that what every parent wants? For their children to go further, shine brighter, be recognized for the very legacy you bled to create. There was a kind of pride in seeing customers who once came to us for bread and eggs now shopping in supermarkets that carried our name. Employees we had known since they were teenagers became managers with families of their own. At Christmas parties, we gathered not just with kin but with dozens of staff who felt like extended family. It was more than business, it was community, it was belonging. But woven into that pride, if I look back carefully, was something else. A shadow. You see, success is like a mirror. It reflects the best and worst in everyone who stands before it. For Mark and me, success reflected gratitude, even disbelief. We never forgot how fragile it all was, how quickly it could collapse. But for David, the reflection was different. Success seemed to whisper to him, "This is not enough." I noticed it in his eyes when he toured a store, scanning the shelves not with appreciation but with hunger for more. I saw it in the way he spoke at meetings, impatient with old traditions, eager to replace loyalty with efficiency. At first I thought it was natural. He was young, ambitious. But ambition, left untempered by humility, can warp into something dangerous. Still, at the time, I told myself everything was fine. After all, hadn't he helped us grow? Hadn't his ideas proven right? When neighbors praised him, I smiled proudly. When magazines wrote about the young financial mind behind our chain, I clipped the articles and tucked them into a scrapbook. I mistook applause for integrity. And so the empire grew, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. We built something larger than ourselves, something we hoped would carry our name long after we were gone. Yet beneath the shining surface, cracks had begun to form. cracks invisible to outsiders but sharp enough to cut deeply when the time came. If I had looked closer, if I had dared to see beyond my pride, I might have recognized those cracks for what they were. They weren't flaws in the business. They were flaws in the heart of the very person I trusted most to protect it. But hindsight is a cruel gift. At the time, all I saw was light, and light, as I would learn too late, can blind you to the shadows gathering at its edges. Loss has a way of hollowing out a person, leaving behind an echo that never quite fades. For me, that echo began on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the love of my life, my husband, Mark, took his last breath with a spreadsheet open in front of him. He had survived 56 years of partnership with me. We married young, built a business from nothing, raised 3 children, weathered recessions, illness, and heartbreak together. Through every storm, I could always count on him. Until the day I couldn't. It happened so suddenly, as death often does. Mark was sitting in the office of our main store, red pen in hand, reviewing invoices with the same diligence he had shown since the beginning. One moment he was muttering about costs of produce, the next he slumped forward. By the time anyone reached him, it was too late. A heart attack, they said, quick, painless, but not for me. Grief does strange things to time. In the days after his passing, hours crawled and weeks blurred. The funeral was a haze of flowers and faces I barely recognized. People spoke of Mark as though he were a legend, but to me, he was simply my husband, the man who made coffee too strong, who hummed old gospel songs off-key, who kissed my hand absent-mindedly while driving. The silence he left behind was unbearable. I thought often about retiring then. People said, "You've worked hard enough, Charlotte. Sell the stores, rest, travel, let the young ones take over." And maybe if I had listened, none of what came next would have happened. But I couldn't. The business wasn't just a livelihood. It was the story of our lives woven into every brick and shelf. To abandon it felt like abandoning him. So I stayed. I stayed out of love, out of duty, out of sheer stubbornness. And in doing so, I walked straight into the arms of betrayal. David, my eldest, my pride, my partner in the business, stepped forward with open arms. He told me not to worry, that he would handle the numbers, the contracts, the meetings. "You don't need to tire yourself, Mom," he said with that confident smile that looked so much like Mark's once did. "You focus on what you love, talking with the customers, keeping the spirit of the company alive. Leave the rest to me." And oh, how I wanted to believe him. After all, hadn't he studied business? Hadn't he already proven himself with bold ideas that grew our stores? Wasn't this the very moment we had prepared him for, when the torch would pass from our hands to his? I let him take the spreadsheets. I let him sit at the head of meetings. I let him sign contracts I barely glanced at. While I lingered on the store floor, greeting old customers and fussing over displays of apples and bread, he moved papers across desks and numbers across screens. At first, it felt like relief. Grief is heavy, and handing off responsibility seemed a small mercy. I told myself it was natural, even wise, to lean on my son. My heart whispered doubts, but my mind, clouded by sorrow, clung to trust. Trust is a mother's blindfold, and I wore it willingly. But small signs began to surface. He started skipping our weekly financial reviews, offering excuses about his overloaded schedule. When we did sit together, the reports grew thinner, simplified, as though I had suddenly forgotten how to read a balance sheet. "I don't want to overwhelm you," he'd say kindly, sliding the papers across the desk. Sometimes I'd catch him ending phone calls abruptly when I walked into the office, or closing his laptop too quickly. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone deserves privacy, even sons, but in my chest unease stirred. Outside the office, other things shifted too. My daughter-in-law, once warm and attentive, grew distant. Sunday lunches grew rare. The grandchildren's laughter, once the highlight of my week, faded from my house. I brushed it off as busy schedules, but it stung more deeply than I let on. Still, I said nothing. Perhaps it was because I was tired, perhaps because I was afraid, or perhaps deep down because I already suspected the truth but could not bear to admit it. To question my son was to question my own judgment as a mother. And what mother wants to face the possibility that her greatest pride has become her greatest danger? I see now that grief had weakened me. In losing Mark, I lost not only my partner but also my anchor, the one who saw clearly when my love blinded me. Without him, I leaned too heavily on David. I wanted so badly to believe he was the man his father hoped he'd be. But grief does not excuse blindness. Looking back, I realize I gave him more than trust. I gave him access, authority, and control. I handed him the keys to everything Mark and I had built over a lifetime. And in doing so, I gave him the very tools he would later use to betray me. For those listening who have lived long enough to know the cruelty of loss, perhaps you understand. Grief does not just break your heart, it clouds your vision. It makes you desperate for someone, anyone, to steady the ship so you can just breathe. But sometimes the very hand you cling to for balance is the one pushing you toward the edge. In the months after Mark's death, I convinced myself David was my rock. But he was already laying the groundwork to become my undoing. And when the time came, he would use the very trust I placed in him as the blade to cut me down. Deception rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in like water through a crack, slow, subtle, nearly invisible, until the walls you trusted begin to crumble. Looking back now, I see how many warning signs there were, how many whispers of truth I brushed aside because I could not bear to believe my own son was capable of betrayal. It began with numbers, as it often does in business. For decades, I had balanced the books myself. I knew the rhythm of our finances the way a musician knows the beat of a song. Every dollar in and out had a place, a reason, a pattern. But after Mark's death, when David took control of the finances, I noticed the music faltering. He started postponing our weekly reviews. "I'm swamped this week, Mom. We'll go over everything next time." Next time turned into the week after, and then another. When he finally did sit down with me, the reports were simplified, stripped down like a children's version of the real thing. "I don't want to overwhelm you," he'd say, smiling as though I were a fragile old woman too weary to read numbers. I told myself it was kindness, that he was trying to protect me. But beneath the surface, doubt began to stir. I had not spent 50 years counting pennies only to suddenly forget how to read a balance sheet. It wasn't just the numbers. Meetings began happening behind closed doors. Phone calls were cut short when I entered the room. Documents piled up that required my signature, but he'd slide them across the desk with little explanation. "Just bureaucracy, Mom. Routine stuff, nothing worth worrying about." Routine, that word became his favorite shield. Routine when employees who had worked with us for decades were suddenly fired. Routine when new suppliers I had never heard of replaced the ones who had been loyal for years. Routine when entire departments were restructured without my knowledge. But routine does not explain whispers in the hallway. Routine does not explain the distant look in my daughter-in-law's eyes when I asked why the grandchildren no longer visited. Routine does not explain why the warmth of family dinners cooled into silence. I remember one particular afternoon. I had stopped by the office unannounced. From behind David's door, I heard raised voices. My nephew Christopher, who worked in accounting, was inside. His voice was sharp, angry, filled with something I had never heard before: fear. When the door opened suddenly, Christopher brushed past me red-faced, refusing to meet my eyes. David followed moments later, adjusting his tie, his smile practiced but thin. "Is there a problem, son?" I asked. "Nothing, Mom. Christopher is just confused, mixing apples with oranges. I've cleared it all up." The next day, Christopher was transferred to another store miles away. Promoted, they said. I wanted to believe it, but my heart whispered otherwise. As weeks passed, the tension grew thicker. The house, once filled with laughter of grandchildren, fell silent. My daughter-in-law began to cancel visits, always with polite excuses. "The kids have activities. Michael has work. We're busy." I told myself it was life, that families grow apart. But deep inside, I felt the ice creeping in, isolating me from the very people I loved most. And then there were the objects, small things at first. Keys misplaced. Notes I had written gone missing. A teacup moved from its shelf. I doubted myself. Was I growing forgetful? Was grief clouding my memory? But when the keys appeared one day in the refrigerator, I knew I had not placed them there. Someone wanted me to believe I had. That was when fear and doubt began to twine together. Was my son trying to paint me as senile? Was he quietly weaving a narrative that I was too old, too confused to manage the company? Each missing note, each misplaced object became another thread in the story he wanted others to believe. I began writing everything down, every meeting, every conversation, every suspicion. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sit in Mark's old armchair and question myself. Was grief twisting my thoughts? Was I imagining it all? Or was I finally waking up to a truth too terrible to face? And this is the cruelty of deception. Before you can accuse the betrayer, you first doubt yourself. That is the real prison. You start to wonder if you are losing your mind, if the very people who raised their eyebrows at you are right, if perhaps you really are too old, too fragile, too broken by loss. But deep down, beneath the grief and fear, a part of me knew. I knew those reports were lies. I knew those contracts weren't routine. I knew the boy I once trusted with my life was becoming a man I could not trust at all. For those listening, perhaps you understand this slow erosion. It is not the sudden blow of betrayal that crushes you. It is the drip, drip, drip of suspicion, the small things that eat away at your peace until you no longer trust your own reflection in the mirror. I still remember the night the truth first struck me fully. I was alone, reviewing old papers Mark had kept. His handwriting was careful, precise, full of notes about our assets, properties, investments. But when I compared his lists with the reports David had been giving me, things didn't match. Properties had vanished from the records. Accounts were missing. Entire pieces of our life had been quietly erased. I held those papers in my lap and felt something break. My love for my son warred with my knowledge of numbers, and numbers do not lie. That was the moment I realized the boy I raised had become the man who was dismantling everything Mark and I had built. Still, I said nothing. Not yet, because if I accused him then, with only fragments of proof, he would twist the story against me. No, I would wait. I would gather evidence. I would watch silently even as my heart cracked until I could no longer be ignored. Signs of deception, that is what I had before me. Signs I once brushed aside as coincidences, grief, or my own frailty. But no more. I saw them now for what they were: shadows of a larger betrayal. And soon enough, those shadows would gather into a storm that even David could not hide. Betrayal doesn't always come with a scream or a gunshot. Sometimes it arrives disguised as concern. That was how David set his trap, with a smile and a gentle hand on my arm as though he were protecting me. "Mom," he said one Tuesday morning, "you really shouldn't walk through the warehouse alone anymore. It's not safe at your age. Let me come with you. Better yet, let me take you around myself." To anyone else, it would have sounded like love, a son looking out for his aging mother. But by then I had learned to look past his words. Behind the softness in his voice there was something harder, something cold and calculated. Still, I agreed. I always did, because part of me clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. Maybe he truly cared. Maybe the whispers in my heart were only grief twisting shadows into monsters. The warehouse smelled the same as it always had, a mix of cardboard, detergent, and the faint sweetness of overripe fruit. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across aisles stacked with boxes. Susan, one of our most trusted employees, walked with us. She had been with us for over 20 years, loyal and dependable. I had asked her to help with the inventory check that day. David led us to the walk-in freezer, a towering steel chamber where meats and frozen goods were stored. "Something's wrong with the thermometer," he said casually. "Could you take a look, Mom? You've always been good at noticing details others miss." The flattery was deliberate, and I see that now. But in the moment, I smiled faintly, touched that he still valued my opinion. Susan and I stepped inside. Cold air rushed over us, biting at our skin. I had barely taken 3 steps when I felt the push. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't an accident. It was a shove sharp enough to make Susan gasp. I turned in time to see my son's face twisted into something unrecognizable. His eyes were empty, hard, almost gleeful. Then slam. The heavy steel door shut with a dull, final thud. The sound echoed in my bones. I knew instantly this was no mistake. At first, instinct took over. I pounded on the door, screamed for help, called out his name like a mother refusing to believe the worst. My fists bruised against the steel, my voice cracked until every breath felt like shards of glass. Susan joined me, her palms flat against the door, crying, "Help, somebody help us." But no help came. Then I heard it, his voice. Muffled but unmistakable. "I'm sorry, Mom, it's better this way, quicker, I promise." And then footsteps, calm, steady, fading away. That was when the full weight of it hit me. My son had locked me in here to die. The cold wrapped around us like chains. Within minutes my fingers stiffened, my breath turned into clouds of white mist. I wore only a light sweater, Susan nothing more than her thin uniform. The air bit at us like knives. We searched the freezer desperately, running our hands along the walls, looking for another exit, a maintenance hatch, anything. But there was nothing. The emergency release had been disabled. He had planned this, every detail. My phone showed no signal, neither did Susan's. The thick walls cut us off completely. We were alone, trapped in a coffin of steel and ice. Time slowed. Minutes felt like hours. The cold crept deeper with each passing second. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, my fingers numb and clumsy. I could barely feel my own face. Susan began to cry softly, whispering, "Why would he do this? Why would he hurt his own mother?" I had no answer, only questions that clawed at my heart. Where had I gone wrong? How had my love twisted into his greed? But despair is dangerous in such a place. I knew if we gave in, if we let the cold lull us into stillness, we'd never wake again, so I forced myself to think. I dragged boxes together, tore open packaging, wrapped us in plastic and cardboard like makeshift blankets. We have to stay warm, I told Susan. We have to keep moving. We huddled together in a corner, sharing body heat, whispering anything to keep ourselves awake. We sang children's songs, recited recipes, even told bad jokes. Every word was a battle against the silence. Every laugh, however forced, was an act of rebellion against death. Still the cold gnawed at us. My hands bled from pounding on the door. My lips split, skin turning pale and stiff. Hours blurred. The clock on my watch crawled forward, each minute a torment. Around the 5th hour, hallucinations began. I saw Mark standing in the corner, smiling, beckoning me home. I saw my children as toddlers running through the aisles of our first store. I saw my mother, long gone, knitting calmly as though nothing were wrong. Part of me wanted to surrender, to close my eyes and slip into those visions. But another part, stubborn, furious, defiant, clung to life with both hands. I would not give him the satisfaction. I picked up a metal pipe and began pounding on the shelves in a steady rhythm. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short, sauce, the universal cry for help. I had little hope anyone would hear, but it gave me something to do, something to keep me conscious. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. Susan's voice grew faint, her body trembling uncontrollably. She whispered, "I can't, Mrs. Allen, I can't stay awake." I slapped her cheek gently, begged her not to close her eyes. "If you sleep, you'll never wake up. Stay with me." 7 hours, that's how long we endured. 7 hours of biting cold, pounding hearts, and the steady drumbeat of my pipe against steel. And then just when I thought it was over, I heard a sound, a creak, the handle shifting, the door swung open and light poured in. A woman stood in the doorway, her cleaning cart beside her, eyes wide in horror. "Oh my God," she cried. "There are people in here." Air rushed in, warmer than any summer breeze I'd ever felt. My legs buckled, my body collapsing into her arms. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Susan being lifted out too, her face ghostly pale but alive. We had been found. Saved not by my son but by chance, by a woman who had followed an intuition to check on a strange noise. David thought the freezer would be my grave, but instead it became the furnace that hardened my will. He thought he had silenced me. But in that frozen box my voice was reborn, sharper, stronger. Fueled by rage and survival. The trap had sprung, but it had caught the wrong prey. Time inside that freezer did not move like it does in the world outside. Minutes did not march. They staggered, stumbled, and stretched until they became endless corridors of suffering. Every second inside those steel walls was a lifetime, every breath a negotiation with death. I've heard people say that extreme cold is almost peaceful. They say hypothermia feels like slipping gently into sleep. Whoever told that lie never lived through it. The truth is uglier, crueler. It begins as needles, thousands of them biting at your fingers and toes, piercing skin, burrowing into muscle. It crawls upward, devouring inch by inch until the body feels like it's being consumed from within. At first, I tried to keep moving. I stomped my feet against the frozen floor, swung my arms in circles, forced my lungs to pull in shallow gulps of icy air. Susan did the same, though her thin uniform offered little defense. Each time she stumbled, I reached out, steadying her, whispering, "Stay awake, keep moving, don't stop." The cold was not our only enemy. Silence, thick and oppressive, wrapped itself around us like a shroud. Except for the hum of the refrigeration system, the world was empty. No voices, no footsteps, no hint of rescue. That silence was almost worse than the cold. It made us invisible, erased from the living world. Hours dragged on. Our makeshift shelter of cardboard and plastic dulled the bite of the freezer only slightly. I kept beating that pipe against the shelves, tapping out SOS over and over, refusing to let the rhythm die. It became my heartbeat, my anchor, the one thing tethering me to hope. By the 3rd hour, my body began to betray me. Fingers stiffened until I could barely grip the pipe. My lips cracked and bled when I tried to speak. Each breath felt heavier, harder, like my lungs were filling with ice instead of air. My chest burned, then grew numb, and that numbness terrified me more than pain ever could. Susan's condition worsened faster. Her teeth chattered so violently I feared they might break. She slumped against me, her eyelids fluttering. "I can't, Mrs. Allen," she murmured. "I just want to sleep." "No," I snapped, shaking her shoulders. "If you sleep, you die. You hear me? You stay with me. Tell me something, anything. A story, a song, a prayer." She mumbled about her brother, about the pies her mother used to bake, about a hymn she learned as a girl. Her voice cracked, but it was sound, and sound was survival. I forced myself to answer, to laugh when nothing was funny, to sing when the words dissolved into trembling sobs, anything to fight the cold silence pressing in on us. By the 5th hour, hallucinations crept in like phantoms. At first they were almost sweet. I saw my husband Mark standing in the corner, smiling gently. I reached out to him, desperate for his warmth. He looked so real, his eyes crinkling the way they did when he teased me, his hand extended as though to pull me out of that frozen tomb. But when my fingers brushed the air, there was nothing. Just cold, endless cold. Then came my children, small again, giggling as they played tag through the aisles of our first store. Their laughter was so vivid it pierced me with longing. I wanted to collapse into those memories, let them carry me away. But the rational part of my mind screamed, "This isn't real, it's the cold, stay awake." Susan, too, began to slip into vision. She whispered names I didn't recognize, calling out to people who weren't there. Her hands went still, her shivering slowed, and I knew she was teetering on the edge. I slapped her cheeks gently, begged her to fight. "Think of your family, Susan. Think of tomorrow. Don't let him win." She opened her glassy eyes and whispered, "Why, Mrs. Allen? Why would your son do this?" The question was a knife to my chest. I had no answer, only a hollow echo of why that rattled through my bones. Love twisted into greed, family into betrayal. How does one explain such darkness? By the 6th hour, I felt myself unraveling. Pain gave way to numbness, a frightening emptiness that spread through my limbs. My thoughts slowed, heavy and sluggish, as though wrapped in fog. A calmness settled in, not peace but resignation. I thought of letting go, of closing my eyes and letting the cold carry me to Mark. The temptation was strong, but then anger flared, a stubborn, furious spark that burned hotter than the ice. I would not die here. I would not let my son write the ending to my story. Rage became my furnace, and that furnace saved me. I gripped the pipe tighter, even as my hands bled. I forced my voice to rise above the silence. "Sauce," I shouted, banging the rhythm on the steel shelf, over and over. Louder, harder, my arms screamed with pain, but I refused to stop. Each strike was a declaration, I am still here, I am not gone. Susan's head lolled against my shoulder, but her chest still rose and fell. I whispered in her ear, "Hold on, Susan, we will not die in this box. Not today." By the 7th hour, I was barely conscious. My body was stone, my mind a blur, yet I kept tapping, kept fighting, and then, miracle of miracles, I heard it. A sound different from the hum of machines, a creak, a shift of metal, the door handle, light spilled in, a voice gasped. "Oh my God, there are people in here." I collapsed forward, dragging Susan with me as warm air rushed in like salvation itself. Arms lifted me, blankets wrapped around me. Voices shouted for ambulances. The world returned in fragments, sirens, bright lights, the painful burn of warmth returning to frozen flesh. But even in that chaos, one thought seared into my mind: I had survived. Against all odds, I had survived 7 hours of darkness. And survival was not the end, it was the beginning. Because while David believed the freezer would silence me, it had only sharpened me. It had frozen my love, my doubt, my hesitation, and replaced them with something harder, something unbreakable. The freezer had not been my tomb, it had been my crucible. When the freezer door finally swung open, it was not a grand rescue by flashing lights or heroic shouts. It was something far more ordinary, almost humble, a cleaning woman pushing her cart, pausing when intuition told her something wasn't right. And in that ordinary moment, life returned. I remember the blast of air first. Warm by comparison, though still chilled warehouse air. It rushed over me like sunlight through stained glass, making my body convulse in painful waves. After hours of numbing cold, the return of sensation was agony. My skin burned as if set aflame, my fingers prickled like needles piercing deep into flesh. They call it rewarming shock in the medical books. To me, it felt like being dragged back from the grave. "Help, there are people in here," the woman screamed. Her voice was shrill, terrified, but to me it was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. Hands grabbed me under the arms, pulled me into the corridor, wrapped me in scratchy wool blankets. Susan followed, limp but breathing. I clutched her hand even as mine shook violently. We had survived together. I drifted in and out as paramedics rushed us into ambulances. I remember a voice saying, "Body temp is 82 degrees, severe hypothermia, she's lucky to be alive." I remember another voice muttering, "How the hell did they get locked in there?" No one had answers, not yet. At the hospital, bright lights burned my eyes. Needles pierced my veins. Warm fluids coursing through me. Machines beeped, blankets hummed with circulating heat, oxygen filled my lungs. I was alive, but barely. And though my body trembled with weakness, my mind was clear enough to see one thing: David had failed. When he walked into my hospital room the next morning, his face was a mask of concern. He carried flowers, spoke with practiced worry, played the role of devoted son flawlessly. Nurses smiled at him. Doctors praised him for rushing to his mother's side. To the world, he was a model child. But when our eyes met, I saw the flicker, the fear, the rage, the calculation. He had not expected me to live. And I knew then that survival was only the first victory. The real battle lay ahead. For 3 weeks I stayed in that hospital bed, my body ravaged by frostbite and pneumonia, my lungs struggling, my heart fragile. Doctors called me stubborn, a fighter. They were right. But not in the way they thought. What kept me alive was not just stubbornness, it was fury. I replayed every moment in that freezer, every hallucination, every desperate tap of the pipe. I thought about the boy I had raised, the man who had grown from my flesh and bone, and the monster he had become. And with each memory, my resolve hardened. Still, I kept my silence. I let David sit at my bedside, holding my hand, whispering reassurances when others were watching. I let him play the part, because I had a role to play too. The fragile mother, confused, uncertain, her memory clouded by trauma. He needed to believe I was broken, that I was no threat. That was how I would survive long enough to gather the truth. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, when nurses changed my Roman 4 or checked my vitals, I whispered to myself, not yet, not now, but soon. What struck me most in those weeks was how many people called my survival a miracle. The cleaning woman, Maria, swore it was divine intervention. I wasn't even supposed to be in that part of the warehouse, she told me tearfully. A colleague called in sick, so I covered her shift. I heard tapping, soft, strange. Something told me to check. God sent me there. Maybe she was right, maybe it was God or fate or sheer coincidence. But I know this: miracles often arrive in plain clothes. They don't descend with trumpets or angels. They come in the form of a janitor following a hunch, a stranger listening to a faint rhythm in the dark. They come when hope is nearly gone, reminding us that even the smallest act of attention can change the course of a life. To this day, I keep a small blue cooler on my porch. I bought it deliberately, not to use, but to remind myself. Each time I see it, I remember that freezer, those 7 hours, that miracle escape. It is both a scar and a testament. But miracles don't end with survival. They demand something of you afterward. They ask, what will you do with this second chance for me? The answer was clear. I would not waste it on silence. I began to notice details, small slips in David's performance, a glance too sharp when he thought I wasn't looking, a whisper at my bedside, next time there won't be a miracle, old woman. He believed I was too weak, too confused to fight back, but inside me a plan was already forming. The freezer had not killed me, it had forged me, and like tempered steel, I was stronger, sharper, more dangerous than he could imagine. Still, I carried the weight of sorrow. Every night I asked myself the same question: how did it come to this? How had the boy who once clutched my hand at the market become the man who locked me in to die? There was no answer, only grief. And grief, I've learned, is a wound that never fully closes. But grief can also be fuel. It can sharpen resolve. It can remind you what is worth fighting for. So while the world called it a miracle that I survived, I knew the real miracle was something else entirely. It was that in that frozen tomb, in the darkest hours of my life, I found not just the will to live, but the will to fight, and I would fight. For my husband's memory, for the business we built, for the employees who depended on us, for Susan who had nearly died beside me, and yes, even for the part of me that still mourned the son I had lost long before the freezer. The freezer was not my end, it was my beginning. The miracle was not that I escaped. The miracle was that I emerged with fire in my heart, ready for war. They say battles are won with armies, but I learned the greatest wars are fought in silence. Not with bullets or blood, but with patience, strategy, and the ability to let your enemy believe you are weaker than you truly are. That was how my war with David began, quietly beneath the surface, while I pretended to be nothing more than a fragile old woman. When I first returned home from the hospital, I wore the mask of confusion. Nurses told my children I might never regain full clarity after the trauma. I leaned into that story. I let my hands shake when I picked up a cup of tea. I furrowed my brow when asked the date, giving the wrong answer on purpose. I stumbled through conversations as though memory had slipped through my fingers like sand, and David believed it. He wanted to believe it. That was my weapon, his arrogance. When he came to visit, his voice was honeyed, his touch gentle. Mom, don't strain yourself, just rest, let me take care of things. He spoke as though he were a savior, but in his eyes I saw the predator, testing whether the prey had any fight left. I gave him none. I lowered my gaze, nodded meekly, thanked him for his devotion, let him think I was blind, broken, harmless. But inside, every detail burned into me, every whispered conversation, every forged document, every slip of his mask. I kept notes in a small notebook hidden beneath my mattress, dates, times, phrases. A chronicle of his betrayal disguised as a grandmother's scribbles. If anyone found it, they'd think it nonsense. But I knew it was a map, and one day it would lead to justice. The first ally I gained was not through strategy but through compassion. Linda, a night nurse at the hospital, had sharp eyes and a quiet intuition. She noticed the way David leaned over me when he thought I was sedated, whispering venom under the cover of his smile. She noticed my act, the half-closed eyes, the feigned confusion, and she understood. "I know you're not as lost as you pretend," she whispered one night, adjusting my blanket. I froze, unsure whether to deny it. But then she added, "My first husband tried to kill me too. No one believed me until it was nearly too late. Don't worry, I won't betray your secret." From then on, Linda became my confidante. She smuggled me a small digital recorder her son used for college lectures. "Record everything," she advised. "His words will betray him before his actions do." She also gave me a prepaid phone, untraceable, so I could contact people David didn't know about. That was how I reconnected with Christopher, my nephew, and with David, the other David, not my son but the retired accountant who had been my husband's friend for decades. Together, quietly, we began building a case. Christopher fed me whispers from the company, financial irregularities, hidden accounts, forged contracts. He worked carefully, pretending loyalty to his cousin while secretly digging through records. "He's been embezzling for years," Christopher confided in hushed tones over the phone. "Shell companies, fake suppliers, millions drained bit by bit. And the life insurance policy, $5 million with his name as sole beneficiary. It was signed just weeks before the freezer." My blood ran cold at that. My own son had planned every detail, down to profiting from my death. But I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply wrote it down in my notebook, another line in the story of his downfall. The silent war stretched into weeks. Outwardly, I was the fragile widow, leaning on a cane, fumbling with memory. Inwardly, I was a general gathering her forces. Every visit from David was another opportunity. Every whispered threat, every slip of the tongue I recorded. At night, Linda helped me transfer the files to a small USB drive she kept hidden in a medicine box. The hardest part was my grandchildren. Their visits grew rare, and when they did come, their words carried rehearsed distance. "Grandma, you forget things sometimes," my grandson said once, his eyes darting nervously toward his father. I wanted to scream that it was all a lie, that I was not confused, that I saw everything clearly. But I smiled, stroked his hair, and let him believe what he'd been told. That was the cruelest cut of all, not the freezer, not the cold. Not the lies, but the slow poisoning of family. David's deceit seeped into every relationship, isolating me, painting me as weak and senile while he tightened his grip on the company. But I had something he didn't: patience. One evening, when he thought I was asleep in my hospital bed, he leaned close and whispered, "Next time there won't be a miracle." He thought I couldn't hear, but the recorder in my pocket caught every word. That was the moment I knew the war was no longer about survival. It was about justice. Justice for my husband, whose legacy he was dismantling. Justice for Susan, who had nearly frozen beside me. Justice for myself, who had given him life only for him to try and take mine. Still, I kept my silence. I let him believe he was winning, because a silent war is not about striking first. It's about waiting until your enemy is so certain of victory that he exposes his own throat. And David, my son, my betrayer, was already sharpening the knife for me. What he didn't know was that I was sharpening mine too, in the quiet, in the dark, behind the mask of a confused old woman. The war had begun, and in this war, silence was my greatest weapon. In every battle, there comes a moment when you realize you cannot fight alone. For weeks I had carried the secret like a stone in my chest, feigning confusion by day and recording whispered threats by night. But the weight grew heavier. The more David smiled in public, the more I knew I needed help from people he would never suspect. And slowly I began to gather my allies in the shadows. The first was Christopher, my nephew. He was quiet by nature, not one to draw attention. For years he had worked in our accounting department, tucked away with ledgers and spreadsheets. David had always dismissed him as the bookworm cousin, never realizing that quiet eyes often see the most. Christopher came to me in secret one night while I was still in the hospital. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he set a folder on my lap. Aunt Clara, he whispered. Clara, the name I'll use for myself here, though you know the truth. I've found things in the books. Transfers, contracts, shell company. I think David has been bleeding the company dry for years. I opened the folder with trembling hands. There they were, bank records, forged signatures. Property deeds shuffled from one name to another like cards in a rigged game. My son's initials appeared where they did not belong. It was proof not of his attempt on my life, not yet, but of his greed, his theft, the empire he had been building in the shadows while I trusted him blindly. I wanted to weep, but tears would have blurred the pages. Instead, I looked Christopher in the eye and said, "You've done the right thing, keep looking, but you must be careful. If David suspects you, he won't hesitate to turn on you too." Christopher nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, he already pushed me out of projects. He doesn't trust me, but I'm not going to let him destroy what you and Uncle Mark built." That was the moment I realized I was not as alone as I had believed. The second ally was David, not my son, but an old friend of my late husband. He had been an accountant for decades, the kind of man who could find a missing cent in a sea of numbers. After retiring, he spent his days tending a garden and drinking strong coffee. When I showed him the documents Christopher had uncovered, his eyes widened. "Clara," he said, flipping through the pages with a practiced, "this isn't sloppy embezzlement. This is a full operation. He's not just stealing, he's gutting the company from the inside. Selling assets to shell corporations, laundering money, setting it all up so that when the dust settles, there's nothing left but debts. And do you know who takes the blame in the end?" "I do," I whispered. "Me." He nodded gravely. "That freezer wasn't just about silencing you emotionally, it was practical. With you gone, he inherits power. He ties up the company in bankruptcy, collects insurance, and walks away with everything under his name. Cold, clean, legal, at least on the surface." The words cut deep, but they also lit a fire in me. If David had calculated my death with such precision, then my survival was his greatest miscalculation. Together, Christopher and old David helped me build a wall of evidence. We met in secret, sometimes in diners on the edge of town, sometimes in the garden behind his house. We spoke in hushed tones, passing USB drives and printed documents like spies in a novel. It felt surreal, me, a 70-something grandmother waging war with hidden recorders and financial ledgers, but I had no choice. The third ally came unexpectedly. Susan, the loyal employee who had been trapped in the freezer with me, survived. Her recovery was slow, her health fragile, but her spirit remained unbroken. When she visited me weeks later, her hands still trembling from lingering damage, she said softly, "I remember everything. He locked us in there. I saw his face. I'll testify if I have to." I gripped her hand tightly. "That may put you in danger." She shook her head. "He already tried to kill me once. I'm not afraid anymore. You saved me in there, Mrs. Allen. You kept me awake, made me fight. Now it's my turn to stand by you." Her courage humbled me. It also strengthened me. With Susan's testimony, Christopher's numbers, and old David's expertise, I finally had more than suspicions. I had a case. Still, I knew we had to be careful. David was not stupid. He had already begun laying groundwork to discredit me, arranging doctors' visits, whispering to others about my supposed memory lapses. He was building a narrative of incompetence, a story where I was the confused matriarch clinging to power while he, the devoted son, held everything together. If I challenged him too soon, he would turn that narrative against me. So I played the part he wanted me to play. At family dinners, I asked the same question twice, as though I had forgotten the answer. At meetings, I pretended to tire easily, letting him explain things simply for me. Behind the mask, I recorded, documented, and built my arsenal. It was not easy. Some nights I cried into my pillow, grieving not only for the husband I lost, but for the son who was no longer mine. The boy I once rocked to sleep had become a stranger wearing his face. Betrayal like that isn't just a wound, it's a scar carved into the soul. But then I would think of Mark. I would think of the decades we spent building a life, of the employees who depended on us, of Susan's pale face in that freezer, of Christopher's trembling voice saying, "I found something." And I would dry my tears, because this war was bigger than my grief. It was about truth. By the time winter gave way to spring, the shadows no longer frightened me. They sheltered me. In those shadows, I gathered strength, gathered proof, gathered allies. My son thought I was alone, feeble, powerless. He could not have been more wrong. For the first time since the freezer, I felt something I hadn't dared feel in months. Hope, not the fragile hope of a mother wishing her child will change, but the steady hope of a fighter who knows justice is coming. And when the day arrived, when the masks finally fell and the truth was dragged into the light, I would not stand alone. My allies would be beside me. Quiet people, overlooked people, underestimated people, the kind of people David never thought mattered. But together, in the shadows, we were preparing a reckoning. Deception, once begun, has no end until it is exposed. David had already tried the freezer, and when that failed, he turned to another plan. He called it recovery, a quiet retreat to a supposed lake house where I could heal away from the noise of the city. But I knew better. The lake house wasn't a sanctuary, it was a grave. He introduced the idea gently, almost tenderly. "Mom," he said one afternoon at the hospital, "you need peace, a place to rest. Far from stress and prying eyes. I bought a beautiful lake house for you. It's quiet, surrounded by woods, perfect for recovery, you'll love it." To anyone else, it sounded like kindness. Who wouldn't want to recover in a serene lakeside home? But the way he said it, the urgency in his eyes, the too perfect timing, it all rang hollow. I asked myself, when had we bought this lake house? Mark and I never spoke of such a thing, and why now? When my health was fragile and suspicion hung thick in the air, I pretended confusion. "The lake house, did your father buy it?" "I don't remember." David forced a smile. "Yes, Mom, we bought it recently. Don't you remember? You signed the papers yourself." His words dripped with false certainty, as though by repeating the lie he could stitch it into my memory. But I had already learned the power of silence. I nodded slowly, let my eyes drift, and whispered, "Maybe I forgot." That night when he left, I turned on the recorder Linda had given me and left a message on his voicemail, feigning disorientation. "David, dear, I'm a little confused. Which lake house are we going to? The one on Lake Erie or the other one? I can't remember if we bought it before or after your father passed." When he returned the next morning, irritation flickered across his face. He leaned close, speaking softly but with steel in his voice. "Don't ever mention the lake house to anyone else, Mom. That's private. Just trust me, it's for your own good." My recorder caught every word. Later that week, Christopher confirmed the truth. "Aunt Clara, I found the deed. The lake house exists, but it's not in the company's name. It's under Mr. Investments, David's shell corporation. It cost nearly $5 million. And get this, he bought it just weeks before the freezer." My stomach tightened. The pieces fit too neatly. The freezer had failed. The lake house was plan B. He wanted me isolated, away from anyone who might interfere. He wanted me gone quietly, with no freezer door to slam, no employee to testify, no miracles to intervene. But the arrogance of evil is that it often overplays its hand. In his rush to appear devoted, David revealed too much. He spoke of the lake house constantly, dangling it like bait. "Fresh air, Mom, you'll love it. The nurse will be there around the clock. I'll visit every day. You'll finally rest." Rest. That word chilled me more than the freezer ever had. I leaned into the charade. I acted eager to go. "That sounds lovely, son. I do feel so tired lately. Perhaps you're right. I should let you take care of me." My false submission made him glow with satisfaction. He believed he had broken me, that my will had snapped in the ice. But while he planned my removal, I planned his downfall. Christopher hacked into his emails, finding searches about hypothermia, insurance policies, and most chilling of all, legal procedures for declaring a parent incompetent. David wasn't just planning to kill me. He was building an entire narrative to erase me. If he succeeded, history would say I was a confused old woman who died peacefully at a lake house retreat, leaving her brilliant son to carry on the family business. But history, I decided, would not be written by him. I showed the recordings to Linda. She shook her head in disbelief. "He's setting up the perfect crime," she whispered. "But he's sloppy. He talks too much. Keep recording. One day he'll give you the confession you need." And he nearly did. One evening when he thought I was drifting in and out of sleep, he whispered in my ear, "Next time there won't be a miracle. You'll thank me when it's over." He didn't know the recorder under my pillow was catching every syllable. Still, I had to be careful. Susan, still recovering from her own ordeal, warned me too. "He'll try again, Mrs. Allen. You can't go with him to that lake house. Promise me you won't." I squeezed her hand. "I promise, but I'll make him believe I will. That's how we'll catch him." The lake house lie became his obsession. Every conversation circled back to it. "You'll love the porch overlooking the water. We'll get you a rocking chair just like Dad used to have." His words sounded tender, but behind them I heard the hiss of the trap snapping shut. Yet he underestimated me. He thought age had made me soft, that grief had left me blind, that the freezer had broken my will. What he didn't know was that betrayal sharpens sharper than any blade. Every time he mentioned the lake house, my fury grew colder, my resolve harder. One afternoon, when he pressed me again, I looked him straight in the eye and said softly, "I trust you, son. Take me wherever you think best." His smile widened, triumphant. He thought he had won. But in truth, that was the moment he lost. Because while he plotted my disappearance at a lake house, I was plotting his downfall in boardrooms and back offices. Christopher gathered documents, old David prepared legal files, Linda safeguarded recordings. Susan stood ready to testify. David thought he was writing the final chapter of my life, but I was writing the prologue of his reckoning. The lake house was not my end, it was his undoing. Here is *** Part 12, Confrontation and Arrest ***, expanded into 901,000 words in American English, keeping the story gripping yet reflective. There comes a moment in every silent war when shadows are no longer enough. Secrets must be dragged into the light, lies torn apart in front of witnesses. For months I had gathered proof, documents, recordings, testimony. For months I had played the fragile old woman, feigning confusion while sharpening my weapons in silence. But patience has an expiration date. And the day came when the masks had to fall. The confrontation unfolded not in a courtroom or a dark alley, but in the very heart of our legacy, the boardroom of our company headquarters. That room had seen decades of decisions, arguments, and triumphs. The long mahogany table had borne witness to Mark's careful planning, to my husband's laughter when a risk paid off, to the ink stains of contracts that built our empire brick by brick. It was fitting that it would also witness the truth about our son. I arrived with Christopher at my side, his face pale but resolute. Old David, my husband's friend and accountant, carried a thick folder of documents. Susan, her hand still scarred from frostbite, sat quietly near the back. Linda, the nurse, stood by the door, a silent guardian who had seen more than anyone suspected. David entered with his usual confidence, flanked by lawyers and board members who had come to trust his polished charm. He carried himself like a king about to be crowned. To him, the meeting was merely another step in consolidating power. He believed I had finally surrendered, that this would be the day I handed him full control. He could not have been more wrong. "Mother," he said warmly, kissing my cheek before taking his seat. "I'm so glad you could join us. I know these meetings can be confusing, but don't worry, I'll guide us through." I let the words wash over me without reaction. Let him play his part. Let him believe. The meeting began with routine matters, financial updates, expansion proposals. David spoke smoothly, confidently, dazzling the room with charts and jargon. Board nodded, impressed, their eyes shining with admiration. Then when the time was right, I cleared my throat. "I have something to share," I said softly. My voice trembled just enough to appear frail, yet steady enough to command attention. Heads turned, David's smile faltered. Old David slid the folder across the table toward me. My fingers, though still stiff from the freezer, opened it with deliberate care. "These," I continued, "are records of transfers, shell corporations, and forged contracts. Millions of dollars siphoned from our company into accounts controlled by my son." The room stilled. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. David laughed lightly, dismissively. "Mother, with all due respect, you're confused again. Those are complicated financial structure. You don't understand." I leaned forward. "Perhaps, but he does." I gestured to old David, who began explaining with precision, account numbers, dates, signatures. Patterns too consistent to be coincidence. Christopher added his testimony, showing documents retrieved from internal systems. With each page turned, each figure revealed, the mask slipped further from my son's face. Still he fought. "This is nonsense, fabrications, they don't prove anything." That was when I pressed play on the recorder. His voice filled the room, clear and undeniable. "Next time there won't be a miracle. You'll thank me when it's over." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Board members stared horrified. His lawyers paled. And David, my son, my betrayer, went cold. He tried to recover, stammering excuses. "Taken out of context, she's sick, she doesn't know what she's saying. You all know she's been struggling with memory." But then Susan stood. Her voice shook, but her words rang clear. "I was there. He locked us in that freezer. I saw his face before the door closed. I heard his footsteps as he walked away." Gasps rippled across the room. Whispers filled the silence. The weight of testimony, documents, and recordings pressed down on him like chains. For a moment I thought he might deny it to the end, but something cracked in him. Rage, sharp and unfiltered, burst through the veneer. He slammed his hand on the table, eyes blazing. "You think you can take this from me after everything I've built? This company is mine, you're all nothing without me." Those words sealed his fate. The door opened and uniformed officers stepped inside. They had been waiting, tipped off by Linda with the evidence we had quietly shared. The boardroom that had once been a place of strategy became a place of reckoning. "David Allen," one officer announced, "you are under arrest for attempted murder, embezzlement, and fraud." The look on his face in that moment will haunt me forever. Not fear, no, not at first, but disbelief, as though the universe itself had betrayed him. He looked at me, his own mother, with eyes full of hatred and sorrow all at once. "You were supposed to be gone," he whispered. "Why couldn't you just die?" I met his gaze, tears in my eyes but my voice steady. "Because David, love makes us blind, but betrayal makes us strong." They led him out in handcuffs. The board sat in stunned silence. Some averted their eyes, ashamed they had trusted him. Others looked at me with newfound respect, even awe. But I felt no triumph, no victory, only grief. Grief that the boy I once held close, the boy I once believed would carry our family's legacy, had become the man in chains. The confrontation was over. The arrest was made. The silent war had finally erupted into the open. But as I sat at that table, staring at the empty chair where my son had just sat, I realized something bitter and unshakable. Winning does not always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like loss in disguise. After the handcuffs clicked and David was led out of the boardroom, silence fell like a heavy curtain. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the air is still heavy with rain and the ground lies broken beneath your feet. We had exposed the truth, yes. Justice was in motion, but the damage, oh, the damage remained. The company my husband and I built from nothing was fractured. The board was shaken, employees were whispering. And our reputation, once solid as oak, was cracking under the weight of scandal. Reporters sniffed around like vultures, circling the story of a mother betrayed by her son. Customers questioned whether their loyalty had been misplaced. Suppliers demanded reassurances that we would not collapse under debts uncovered in David's schemes. It felt for a time like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath my feet shifting with every gust of wind. But I had not survived a freezer, 7 hours of darkness, and months of deceit to watch everything crumble. If David's betrayal had been the storm, then I would be the hands that rebuilt after it. The first step was gathering the team that remained loyal. Christopher, brave despite his youth, took on more responsibility, combing through every account, every ledger, unraveling the tangled web David had spun. Old David, with his sharp accountant's mind, helped piece together what could be salvaged and what was lost forever. Susan, though still fragile, returned to the office part-time, her presence a reminder that loyalty could survive even in the harshest cold. We met every morning around a battered oak table in the back office. No grandeur, no polished speeches, just work. "This supplier needs reassurance," Christopher would report. "We'll lose them if we don't act quickly." Or, "This property was nearly sold through one of David's shell corporations. We need to reclaim it before it's gone." It was exhausting. Some days stretched into nights, my body aching, my mind heavy. But each small victory became a stone laid in the foundation of recovery. A supplier renewed their contract. A store reopened under honest management. A headline shifted from scandal to resilience. Slowly, painfully, we began to mend. The hardest part was facing the employee. Many of them had seen David as their future. He was young, modern, charismatic. When news broke of his arrest, some defended him, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Others, who had sensed his cruelty in small ways, nodded grimly as though justice had finally caught up. I stood before them in the warehouse one gray morning, my cane steadying me, my voice trembling but strong. "I know you are afraid," I told them. "I know trust has been broken, but this company was never about one man. It was built on the backs of all of us, on loyalty, on hard work, on the belief that honesty still matters. David tried to take that from us. But we are still here, and together we will rise again." They applauded softly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the warehouse. It wasn't just for me, it was for themselves, for the idea that their labor still meant something. That day I felt a spark of the pride Mark and I once shared. Yet even as the company steadied, my heart struggled. Nights were the hardest. I would sit alone in my living room, photos of my children on the mantel, and the tears would come. Memories of David as a boy flooded back, his laugh, his eagerness, the way he once ran to me with scraped knees asking for comfort. How had that child become the man who tried to bury me in ice? I grieved not only the son I lost, but the illusions I had clung to. Parenthood, I learned, does not guarantee virtue. Love does not prevent betrayal, and sometimes the blood you trust most becomes poison in your veins. But grief, like ice, can either freeze you or sharpen you. I chose the latter. Each time sorrow threatened to consume me, I thought of Susan's courage, Christopher's loyalty, old David's determination. I thought of the employees who needed stability, of the grandchildren who deserved a legacy untarnished by lies. And I rose each morning, shoulders heavy but spirit unbroken. We implemented new systems, transparency, oversight, checks that no single person could override. I insisted on it, not out of paranoia, but out of hard-earned wisdom. Trust, once broken, must be rebuilt on stone, not sand. Within a year, the company's reputation began to heal. Customers returned, suppliers praised our integrity, and the whispers of scandal faded into the background. We were no longer just a family business. We were a community restored by resilience. Yet the scars remained. Every empty chair at family gatherings reminded me of the cost. Every headline about David's trial reopened the wound. People asked how I felt, whether I hated him. I always answered truthfully. I did not hate my son. Hate would have been easier. What I felt was deeper, harder to carry, a sorrow that no verdict could erase. Still, I found strength in the act of rebuilding. It became more than saving a company. It was reclaiming a legacy, proving that one man's betrayal could not erase decades of honest work. It was telling the world that resilience is stronger than greed. And perhaps most importantly, it was reminding myself that survival is not enough. To truly live after betrayal, you must pick up the pieces, not perfectly, not without scars, but with the courage to move forward anyway. The freezer had tried to take my life. My son had tried to take my legacy, but both had failed, because I was still here, standing in the ruins, gathering the broken shards and building something new. And though my heart would never fully heal, I knew this. I had chosen to live, and in living I had already won. They call it justice when a criminal is punished, but a mother's heart does not measure justice in verdicts or prison terms. It measures in memories, tiny, fragile fragments of a life once held close. And in that measure, justice always feels hollow. When the trial began, I sat quietly in the gallery, my cane resting against my chair, my body frail but my spirit steady. The prosecutors laid out the case with precision: the embezzlement, the shell companies, the forged signatures, the attempt on my life. They played the recordings of his voice, cold and chilling, whispering promises of my end. They brought Susan to the stand, her trembling testimony recounting the night of the freezer. Christopher, pale but brave, presented the financial trail. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together until there was no doubt left. The jury looked at him not as a son, not as a businessman, but as a man who had betrayed every bond of love and trust. They returned swiftly with their verdict: guilty. The room buzzed with murmurs. Some gasped, some nodded grimly, others simply stared. The judge delivered his sentence: decades behind bars, the rest of his youth and middle age erased by cold stone walls. It was, by all accounts, justice, but when I looked at David, my boy, I did not feel triumph. I felt something far more terrible: grief. Because sitting there, in a suit too large for his frame, shackled by iron chains, he was still the child I once rocked to sleep. I saw him at 6 years old, running to me with a scraped knee. I saw him at 12, clutching his first ledger book proudly. I saw him at 20, standing beside his father in the store, his eyes shining with ambition. I saw every version of him at once, every smile, every laugh, every promise. And then I saw the man who had tried to kill me. The two images refused to reconcile. They battled inside me until my heart felt torn in two. When the bailiff led him away, David turned his head slightly. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. His expression was not rage this time, not triumph, not even fear. It was something that cut me deeper than any of those: sorrow, as though in that final moment he remembered too. That night I returned home to a house too quiet. Photographs lined the mantel: family dinners, Christmas mornings, birthdays filled with candles and laughter. In each one, David's face appeared, smiling, innocent, untouched by greed. I traced those photos with trembling fingers, and the tears finally came. People congratulated me after the trial. They called me brave, resilient, strong. You survived, they said. You won. But it did not feel like winning. It felt like burying a son who was still alive. For weeks, grief consumed me. I wandered through memories like a ghost, hearing echoes of his laughter in the halls. Every corner of my home held pieces of him: his childhood drawings folded in a box, his baseball glove tucked in the attic, the faint scrawl of his handwriting on old grocery lists. Each artifact was a dagger, a reminder of what had been lost long before prison claimed him. It would have been easier, perhaps, to hate him. Hate is clean. Hate cuts ties. But love does not die easily, even when betrayed. Love lingers, stubborn as ivy, wrapping itself around wounds until they ache with every breath. I could not hate my son. I could only grieve him. One afternoon, I visited Mark's grave. I knelt slowly, placing fresh flowers by the stone, and whispered into the silence. We built so much together, you and I. We gave him everything we had, but somehow, somewhere we lost him. I'm sorry, Mark, I tried. The wind stirred, rustling the trees, and for a moment I felt his presence, steady, patient, forgiving. And I realized then that grief was not only mine to carry. It belonged to all who had loved David, to all who had believed in him. But grief, like love, cannot be the end of the story. It must teach us something. And so I began to share my story, not just with the company, not just with friends, but with anyone who would listen. I spoke of betrayal, yes, but also of resilience, of the fire that can be born even in the coldest places. I spoke of the danger of ignoring small signs, of the importance of listening to whispers before they become storms. And I spoke most of all of love, the love that blinds us, the love that wounds us, and the love that refuses to die even when everything else does. In those conversations, I found a measure of healing. Not complete, healing never is, but enough to let me breathe again. Enough to remind me that while I had lost one son to greed, I had not lost myself. For those of you listening who are older, who know the sting of disappointment, who have buried dreams along with loved ones, you understand. You know that grief is not a guest who visits and leaves. It is a companion who walks beside you, sometimes silent, sometimes screaming, but always there. My grief will never end. It will soften, perhaps grow quieter with time, but it will never vanish. And maybe that is right, because grief, I've learned, is love with nowhere to go. And despite everything, despite betrayal, despite chains, despite all the pain, I will not stop loving my son. That is my curse, that is my truth. But love, even in grief, can also be a strength. It keeps us human, it keeps us whole, even when the world tries to shatter us. So I carry my grief not as a burden, but as a reminder of what I gave, what I lost, and what I still refuse to let die. A mother's grief is endless, but so too is a mother's love. When people ask me how I endured the freezer, the betrayal, the trial, I tell them it wasn't strength alone. It was the knowledge that life, even in its darkest hours, still has lessons to teach. At nearly 80 years old, you'd think I'd learned all there was to know. But betrayal, survival, and grief carved wisdom into me sharper than time ever could. The greatest lesson, that the human spirit is far stronger than we dare to believe. I remember the night after the trial. Sitting in my living room, surrounded by silence. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that follows a long storm. My cane rested against my chair, the photos of Mark and the children lined the mantel. For the first time in months, I wasn't planning, fighting, or pretending. I was simply still. And in that stillness, I asked myself, what was it all for? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking through clouds. It was for the reminder that even when the people we love most fail us, life itself gives us the chance to rise. Betrayal does not have to be the end of a story. Sometimes it can be the beginning of something truer, something harder one. When I speak to others now, employees, neighbors, even strangers who have read about my ordeal, I do not tell them about the courtroom or the ledgers first. I tell them about the freezer. About the moment when I thought I would die, when the cold pressed against my bones, and how a simple decision to keep tapping, to keep breathing, to keep fighting kept me alive. Because life, I learned, is not about avoiding darkness. It's about refusing to let the darkness define your end. Another lesson etched into me is the danger of blindness. As mothers, as fathers, as grandparents, we want to see only the best in those we love. We take pride in their cleverness, excuse their faults, dismiss their cruelty as youthful ambition. But love cannot replace vigilance. Ignoring red flags does not protect our children, it only empowers the darker parts of them to grow unchecked. I ignored too much for too long. I mistook David's cunning for brilliance, his manipulation for leadership, his ambition for promise. I told myself it was pride, but in truth it was fear of admitting that my son was not the man I wanted him to be. If there is one message I would leave behind, it is this: love your children fiercely, but do not let love blind you to truth. Truth is the soil in which love must grow. Without it, love turns into poison. And yet, even with all I know now, I cannot hate him. That may surprise you. Hate seems natural, justified even after all he did. But hate is heavy, corrosive, devouring the soul from the inside. My heart is scarred enough without letting hate take root. Instead, I choose sorrow, I choose grief. And strangely, I choose love, the kind that does not excuse, that does not deny, but that mourns what could have been. Because forgiveness, I have learned, is not about freeing the one who wronged you. It is about freeing yourself. I cannot erase what David did. I cannot undo the freezer, the lies, the trial. But I can refuse to let them define the rest of my days. That is my forgiveness, not forgetting, not excusing, but choosing peace over bitterness. As for the company, it lives on. We were built stronger and steadier than before. Systems of oversight, transparency, and shared responsibility ensure that no one person holds unchecked power again. Employees walk through the aisles with pride, knowing their labor serves not greed but community. And when I greet customers, cane in hand, they smile and say, "You're still here, Mrs. Allen." Yes, I am still here. That is the miracle. That is the victory. For those of you listening, perhaps sitting in your own living rooms, memories crowding your heart, I know you understand. At our age, we carry not just years but stories. Stories of love, of loss, of betrayal, of resilience. We know that life does not promise ease. It promises lesson, and it asks us each day to decide whether we will rise or surrender. So here is my final lesson: do not surrender. Not to cold, not to betrayal, not to grief. Keep tapping on the steel walls of your life. Keep sending your SOS into the silence. Because sometimes when hope seems gone, a miracle comes. And even if it doesn't, the act of fighting itself is the miracle. I carry many scars on my body from frostbite, on my heart from betrayal. But I also carry something greater, the knowledge that I endured, that I lived through the darkest hours and came out stronger. That resilience is not for the young alone. It is for all of us at every age, as long as breath fills our lungs. And if my story reaches you, may it remind you that it is never too late to rise, never too late to fight, never too late to learn. Even in the final chapters of life, there are lessons that can shape us, strengthen us, and perhaps inspire those who come after. At nearly 80, I have learned this above all. Life is fragile, love is complicated. Betrayal is devastating, but the fire within us is stronger than any storm, any freezer, any loss. And as long as that fire burns, the story is never over. Perfect. Here's the asterisk 300-word summary that wraps up the 15-part script, closing with the farewell line exactly as instructed. This story began with a sound, an ordinary freezer door slamming shut, and the extraordinary truth that it revealed. What unfolded across 15 parts was not only the tale of one woman's survival, but also a reflection on family, betrayal, resilience, and the lessons life offers even in its twilight years. From the early days of building a family business brick by brick, through the pride of watching a son's ambition grow, the journey seemed full of promise. But ambition turned to greed, and greed to betrayal. The loss of a husband left a widow vulnerable, and trust placed in the wrong hands became the weapon used against her. Locked in a freezer by her own son, she endured 7 hours of darkness, clinging to life through sheer will and fury. Her escape was nothing short of a miracle. Yet survival was only the beginning. Through careful patience and allies in the shadows, she uncovered a web of deception, embezzlement, fraud, lies, and a lakehouse trap that would have ended her life quietly. With evidence gathered and courage sharpened, the confrontation came in a boardroom where masks fell and justice was finally served. But victory was bittersweet. Justice came at the cost of a mother's grief, a son's downfall, and a family forever fractured. Still, from the ruins rose resilience. The company was rebuilt with transparency and loyalty, a symbol of strength against betrayal. And in the end, the final lesson emerged. Love can blind, betrayal can wound, but the fire within us, the refusal to surrender, can carry us through even the darkest trials. This is not just a story of survival. It is a reminder: do not surrender, keep tapping, keep fighting. The fire within you is stronger than the cold.